Hi everyone, this is an RTX 3060 Ti, a graphic card by Nvidia released back in 2020. Right now, a brand new one costs around 300 to 350 US dollars. Today, I'll be benchmarking some games on it to see how it holds up in 2024 and also if it's worth getting one. Now, I was a bit skeptical before buying it as it only has 8 GB of VRAM and we all know how modern games are optimized. It also lacks the new frame generation and DLSS 3 support. Then why did I choose this? Well, I had a limited budget and there were not many options at this price point. I bought this one used for around 18,000 Indian rupees or approximately 220 US dollars, which you too can find on the used market for similar price. For today's testing, I paired it with an Core i5-12400F and 32 GB of DDR4 RAM. Here are the full specs along with the GPU-Z details for your reference. Before we start, I'd greatly appreciate if you can take a moment and hit that like and subscribe. Let's get into the benchmarks. The first game I tested is Counter-Strike 2 at 1080p with high settings. With no upscaling enabled, the game averaged at 270 FPS with a 1% loss at 134. These numbers are fantastic for a super competitive experience. The next one is Witcher 3 with the next gen update. At 1080p ultra settings and ray tracing turned off, the game runs at an average of 74 FPS with 1% loss at 50. I've set the game's sharpness to high, which resulted in over sharpening in the footage. However, there were no performance issues whatsoever. At 1080p Ultra, without upscaling or ray tracing, Cyberpunk performed well with an average of 70 FPS with 1% loss at 45. The game looked great and ran without any frame drops. Now, while lowering the settings to high would give you a 10 to 20 FPS boost, I just wanted to see how the card performs under maximum load. In order to test some ray tracing, I had to turn down the graphics settings to high and enable DLSS while setting it in quality mode. I must say, the game looks stunning while performing great at the same time. With averages of 60 FPS and 1% loss at 39, the gameplay felt solid, and I must say, this was a visual treat for the eyes. Days Gone was one of the underrated games I've enjoyed in a very long time. While set to 1080p maximum settings, the game ran with an average of 112 FPS. With 1% loss at 73, this was a great experience and I recommend everyone to try this game. Far Cry 6 with everything set to maximum and ray tracing turned on ran flawlessly with an average of 86 with 1% loss of 63. Now, turning off the ray tracing or enabling FSR will give you a significant FPS boost. I felt at 1080p this was just acceptable. Now, Fortnite for some reason had a lot of status with DirectX 12, so I had to go with DirectX 11. With the game set to 1080p high, it ran flawlessly with an average of 152 FPS. The 1% loss at 91 indicates that there was little to no stutter, at least after playing a couple of games. Forza Horizon 5 is one of the well-optimized games out there and it ran very well at 1080p. At ultra settings and ray tracing turned on, it ran with over 100 FPS. Now, as this is not a fast-paced game, I prefer to turn off the settings for a cost of the few frames. But you can always turn on DLSS or any upscaling to get better frames. Spider-Man Remastered with ray tracing enabled performed and looked great at 1080p very high. Even without upscaling, the game managed to average at a smooth 72 FPS with 1% loss at 45. Even though it's my personal choice, you can always turn off the ray tracing to get more frames. I saw an actual increase of 10 to 20 FPS with ray tracing turned off. Rockstar's Red Dead Redemption 2 never fails to impress me. At 1080p Ultra with no upscaling enabled, ran smooth like a butter with an FPS average of 68. It almost never dropped from 60 even in the busier areas like Saint Denis, indicated by the 1% loss. The last game I've tested at 1080p is The Last of Us Part 1. At ultra preset, FSR was set to quality and frame generation was turned on. Oh boy, the game, I don't need to explain this as the numbers on the screen tell a better story. Now the frame time graph looked awful, but the game was smooth without any noticeable input lag.
Whoa, look!
At 1440p with FSR set to quality, Far Cry 6 with max settings and ray tracing turned on ran identically to 1080p, averaging 78 FPS with 1% loss at 64. I also noticed at 1440p the GPU was less bottlenecked by the i5 and produced more consistent frame rates. Fortnite ran similarly if not better at 1440p. With DLSS set to quality and the same high settings, the game averaged at 138 with the 1% loss at 92. Now the numbers indicate that the gameplay was smooth and I experienced no frame drops during the entire match. Now you can still enjoy some ray tracing at 1440p in Spider-Man Remastered. With the very high preset and DLSS set to quality, the game averaged at 67 with 1% loss at 40. Now if you are playing on a TV with a controller, capping the FPS to 60 and can eliminate any stutters and produce even more consistent frame rates. Forza Horizon 5 as expected at 1440p ultra preset and DLSS set to quality, averaged at 92 with 1% loss at 79. The game looked much better at 1440p due to higher texture quality and personally I'd avoid 1080p in all the titles for this. Now as expected, Red Dead Redemption 2 with ultra preset and DLSS set to quality ran flawlessly. The game dropped to low 50s in busier areas, however it looked much sharper due to the increase in resolution, and this overall made the game much more immersive. As this is not a fast paced game, I chose to keep the same quality settings, however, dropping settings can easily achieve 60 FPS all the time. At 1440p in The Last of Us Part 1, I had to turn down the settings to high with frame generation still turned on. The game still managed to average at 88 with 1% loss at 60, which was fantastic.
There's stairs over there.
Stay low.
With DLSS enabled and set to quality, Witcher 3 at 1440p ultra settings performed similarly, if not exactly the same as 1080p. I reran the test couple more times and the results were similar, so the numbers were definitely not wrong. Now at 1440p turning down the settings to high with no ray tracing and DLSS set to quality, Cyberpunk averaged at 83 FPS with 1% loss at 54. The numbers were great and even in the most intensive areas the game didn't drop to below 60 and it was much sharper compared to 1080p. Days Gone at 1440p with max settings returned an average of 83 and 1% loss of 67. Now comparing the numbers to 1080p, sure the average dropped, but the 1% loss indicate that the game was smooth without any stutters. Starting off with Forza Horizon, at 4K Ultra, DLSS was set to balanced and ray tracing was turned off. At these settings, the game managed to deliver a decent average of 47 and 1% loss of 60. Now this is at Ultra preset, so lowering the settings will definitely have a significant FPS boost. Witcher 3 becomes intensive at 4K. The settings were turned down to medium and with DLSS set to balanced, the game managed to deliver a very acceptable 54 FPS average and 1% loss of 43. Now it's not a solid 60 FPS, but I couldn't tell the difference with the FPS overlay turned off. Days Gone at 4K and high preset still managed to deliver a solid 60 FPS average with 1% loss of 50. I felt like there was no need to decrease any graphical settings as this was perfect for me. Far Cry 6 was sharp and crisp at 4K. With ray tracing turned off and FSR set to ultra quality, the game averaged 62 FPS with 1% loss of 52. Definitely not bad considering we are using ultra settings at 4K, but those who want more frames can set the FSR to quality or even balanced. Fortnite at low settings, medium view distance and DLSS set to quality performed better than I thought. We got an average of 126 FPS with 1% loss of 72. The game didn't look bad either compared to the performance mode, which removes most of the effects. Now you can go lower to performance mode or set DLSS to balanced, but this was okay for me. Huge respect to Rockstar Games. Turning down the settings to medium with ultra textures and DLSS set to quality, Red Dead Redemption 2 still gave a very respectable 59 FPS average. Despite the lowered settings, the game still looks breathtaking and performed very well considering the 1% loss of 49. Cyberpunk 2077 at 4K medium settings and DLSS set to balanced performed similarly to Red Dead Redemption 2 with an average of 58 FPS and 1% loss of 51. Now during my 30 minutes benchmark run, the game never dropped below 50 and I'm definitely impressed by this card at this point. The Last of Us Part 1 was set to medium with high textures, and with the help of frame generation, the game managed 62 FPS average and 1% loss of 40. I thought that the frame generation would make input lag worse, but no, it was very minimal in this game and it was very well playable.
You, Bill.
Where do you usually meet him?
Now the last game we have tested at 4K is Spider-Man Remastered. With high settings and DLSS set to quality, the game performed like a charm. As you can see by the numbers on the screen, the frame time graph is very smooth, which indicates minimal to no stutter. This brings us to the conclusion of this video. Was the 3060 Ti worth it, and should you get one? Well, it depends. I'm going to categorize some parameters which helped me choose this card and will also help you make a decision. Number 1, what games do you play and at which resolution? Number 2, your budget. Number 3, your system requirements. Games. If you play esports like Counter-Strike, Fortnite, Valorant, then I'd say your CPU matters more than the graphic card. In this case, the 3060 Ti should be more than enough for your gaming needs. Now if you play AAA titles, this is greatly affected by the resolution you're playing at and also the settings you want to play at. At 1080p, this card right now can handle most of the games at Ultra and even some ray tracing just fine. It should be good for a couple of years down the lane, so if you have a 1080p monitor, this card can quench all your gaming needs. 1440p is where things starts to get interesting. Right now, it looks like this card can run most of the games at 60 plus FPS, just fine at reasonable settings and with the help of DLSS. Now, if you're willing to drop your in-game settings a bit, then this card has your back at least for a couple more years. Just do not expect gaming on it at ultra settings due to the lack of VRAM. Now this is not a 4K card by any means, but from the benchmarks we can see that as long as we are willing to drop some settings to either medium or low and use upscaling accordingly, it still has enough juice to handle a bit of 4K gaming, even though I'm not sure how it will handle games in the future. Price. Now if you have a similar budget like me and prefer buying a new graphic card with warranty, then I'd say save some money and get a newer and more powerful generation card. Because with technologies like DLSS 3 and frame generation, you can get playable experiences in modern games even with low-end cards like the 4060. Now if you're okay with the used card, I'd say go for it based on the parameters explained above. Power supply requirements and consumption. Now this card draws around 200 watts of power, which means you need to have a good reliable power supply with at least 650 watts as recommended by Nvidia. I know this is not a big deal for everyone, but if you're living somewhere where electricity is costly, then I'd say getting a more efficient card like the 4000 series will have an impact on your power bills. With that, I conclude this video. Now let me know your thoughts on this card in the comments and I'll see you in the next one.